here's the beautiful thing about the new 12-team college football playoff format. We have a lack of history with it, so it's tough for us to handicap it. Same problem for the bookmakers. And when you have that type of chaos, it creates opportunity. So we welcome in Stanford Steve and Greg McElroy to sort through all of it. Gentlemen, the new playoff format, it has a spot for the highest-ranked non-Power 4 conference champion. Boise State currently the favorite to grab that spot at even money, but get a load of the service academies. Undefeated Army at 18-1 to make the playoff. Undefeated Navy 25-1 to make the playoff. Greg, how would you play this market?
I would be all over Army and Navy. I'd play both. And right now with the American Conference, the likelihood of those two teams potentially playing each other in the conference championship game becomes very real, and that would be the week before the traditional Army-Navy game. So that could potentially be very interesting. I also look at some of the opportunities. Who's to say right now? I mean, how many people can look at Notre Dame and say without a shadow of a doubt, one of these two teams can't get them? I actually think they can. I really believe that. I think these two teams are so different with what they're now doing offensively. And remember, I'm not comfortable laying even money right now with Boise State because it's ultimately going to come down to a Mountain West championship game where they could very easily lose on a neutral site. I'd rather go with a bit of a long shot at 18 or 25-1 where I know I'm going to get big bang for my buck. So even money, Steve, makes no sense whatsoever. But a long shot like Army and Navy, yeah, give me a little of that.
No doubt. And your point about Notre Dame, Greg, Notre Dame lost their best defensive player today in Morrison, who's a pro corner. So that's going to be really interesting that Notre Dame has to play both of those teams. And then what's the fallout of those Army and Navy teams? These odds, you're not going to get better. I'd also bring up a team like UNLV. I know they have a close loss to Syracuse, but they're right around 15, 18-1 also. But I'm with you there with Army and Navy. If you're going to do it, just play both sides, because then you have the dynamic of their traditional game the week after the American Championship. What's that fallout going to be? It's good to have both sides at 18 and 25-1.
It's so wild. They can play each other in the conference championship, then they set the playoff rankings, then those two play again the following week. No one's laying down for the other one in that matchup. To Greg's point about the schedule with Army, that Notre Dame game comes off an Army bye. 2 weeks to get ready for the Irish. That's worth noting. Now, so much focus is generally devoted on this show to the SEC and Big Ten for good reason, but the Big 12 currently has two undefeated teams in Iowa State and BYU. Steve, how are you handicapping the Big 12's playoff chances right now? Could they get more than one team in?
I don't see that. I don't see more than one. And then when you look at the odds, how they have Iowa State, as the favorite now, and then there's Kansas State, and then there's BYU. And that's based off when I look at the schedule remaining for those teams. Monster game, obviously, all the way at the end. But the idea that Iowa State is going to run the table, I love what Rocco Beck has done. But you see the percentages on those wins for games. It's still a lot harder. It's still going to be a really tough challenge to do. So that's why no chance that multiple teams from the Big 12 go. And then when you look at BYU here, Utah, they announced with Rising today. Joe, sorry to bring up Utah. I wasn't going to do it to you. But they are going to be in the mix for multiple of these teams. They are going to be in the mix, and they're going to get somebody because they get them coming to Salt Lake. So it's a one-team bid. I would look at Kansas State just because it's a better price than Iowa State and all the expectations that Iowa State is going to have to live up to every week.
Yeah, pour out a 3-2 beer for Joe's Utah Utes. That's for sure. Not a good day for them at the office last week. But I look at it, guys, and I'm looking at value all throughout this conference. And in a conference where there's chaos, why am I paying a price at 175? Why am I paying a price even to 325? And right now, look, I know that Kansas State went to Colorado and won. It's great, but guess what? The jury's out. When you blitz Avery Johnson, their quarterback, he makes bad decisions. So I'm not touching either of those. I don't even know if I love BYU at 5-1. But I do kind of like Texas Tech at 10-1. I don't hate Arizona State at 15-1. If I can get some long odds in this conference, I'm all for it because I'm anticipating chaos kind of across the board. So I'm looking more for value than I am trying to pick a favorite, at least at this point.
Steve, how many SEC schools do you see getting into the playoff?
This is as tough as it gets right now, but it's super fun, and I'm glad we're touching on it. when I look at it, you basically got 8 teams to get 5 if you want to hit the over, which is the way I would lean. The problem is, if you look at the SEC standings, it's kind of confusing. But the 2 teams in the middle of those standings that don't have a ranking are Arkansas and Vanderbilt. Those 2 teams have pulled off the biggest upsets of the season. And when you look at both of their schedules, they play plenty of these teams that are in the mix for the playoff. The problem is, before the year, we talked about Missouri and Ole Miss as having the best road to the playoff and all the, anxiousness that those fan bases have had to try and make that climb. The problem is they're behind the 8 ball of what everybody had projected. We had Ole Miss in 2 losses, but the problem is we didn't have one of those losses to Kentucky. And then Missouri, what they've looked like to start the season, they're behind schedule. Road trip to Alabama coming up down the road. So I don't feel great about it, but with that plus money and knowing the quality of teams they have, that's where it gets to me. We wonder about the loser of these conference championship games and what's the narrative going to be out of that. I think there's going to be plenty good and more good. When you look at the SEC teams and what they put on tape, it's way better than what you look at across the country, as we just touched on with the Big 12, for instance.
Yeah, I wouldn't touch the over. Even at the price, I kind of like it. I would actually stay away from this thing altogether. There's too many quality teams at the bottom. I mean, you've already referenced Vandy. Vandy still has a couple more giant killer opportunities. They have Texas at their place. They got Tennessee at their place. You look at Oklahoma. They host Bama the week before the Iron Bowl. You look at Arkansas. They host LSU and Texas and Ole Miss. So I don't love those situations. Auburn, they host A&M the week before Texas A&M plays Texas. I wouldn't touch this bet with a 10-foot pole whatsoever. And then the other thing that complicates things. Look, I would take the 10th best team in the SEC, which might very well be, say, Texas A&M. We'll see how it all unfolds. Yeah. But let's just say A&M finishes 9th, 8th, 7th. I'd take them over Indiana more than likely. I'd probably take them over Pitt. Yeah. But those teams right now are sitting at undefeated. They're sitting there in a pretty good spot with some potential losses. Even if they come, they're still going to be in a pretty decent spot to still get in the playoff if they're sitting at 11-1. So I think there's too many surprise undefeateds to put a bunch of money right now on an SEC having more than 4 teams in the final field.
It's wild because so many of these are elimination games like Ole Miss, LSU, and then you're going to have Bama, Tennessee. Someone's losing that, and then Bama's got to play LSU. Someone's losing that. All right, to the game of the week, someone's got to lose this one as well. Texas laying 3.5 at home against Georgia. No movement with that line so far. Steve, where do you see the price closing?
Scott and I talked on our pod after the game Saturday night, and I asked him what he makes the line. He was thinking like 6 or 7, and I said 4. And then when I see it at 3.5, and then there's no budge on the first time it's put out there, that makes me think. But right now on Monday afternoon, as we sit here, I just think about the desperation of Georgia and what they've been and what they've had. Texas is flying high. They've looked great. Ewers, came back. They got the win against their rival. I just look at Georgia as a scary dog here. I'm interested to see if there is line movement. We had similar lines of this magnitude last week when you talk about Ohio State and Oregon not moving off a 3. Penn State, USC hung around 3.5, 4. So I look at anything maybe as a team that looks at Georgia, who's looked more vulnerable, obviously with that loss, as maybe getting more points. I would wait to take it, but right now I lean Georgia.
Greg, you see it sitting there at 3.5. Does anything jump out to you on that?
Yeah, I would be hesitant at this moment to take a side. At 3.5, I lean Texas naturally. If it was 2.5, I'd lean Georgia. It's, just I'm just a crazy person when it comes to football numbers. But what I'd also say is I like over. And while a lot of people will look at this and think, oh, Georgia, Texas's defense, they just held Oklahoma to 3 points. They haven't had anyone go up and down the field on them all year. They haven't seen a wide receiver core that's even close to what Georgia has. And I think that this Georgia passing attack is still very, very good. And I still think that the big question mark about Texas is the back end. Remember Washington last year in the playoff, up and down the field. Now they think that their pass rush has improved. They think their personnel on the perimeter is better, but who have they played against up to this point that's capable of challenging them in those areas? So I'm not sold on Texas being able to defend the deep ball, and we've already seen what Alabama did to Georgia in the back end defensively as well. So I think both quarterbacks have a chance to go off. I'm expecting high scoring, and I'm thinking right now it could become a bit of a track meet because the weak link for both teams right now is likely in the secondary, and that's not a place I want to be weak against with teams like this, with quarterback play like this, and personnel at wide receiver like they're going to see in this game.